They came from the sea with axes, gods of war, and a hunger for gold. But Ireland would change them. Who were these men, these strangers from the icebound north? And why did they carve a second home on the edge of the world? This isn't just a story of conquest. It's a story of transformation, of raiders who became rulers, and of a land that absorbed the fury of the north and gave birth to something new. This is the untold story of the Vikings in Ireland. Long before ironclad ships clawed their way onto Irish shores, the island was already a battlefield, not of empires, but of bloodlines. Over 150 kingdoms carved up the land, and each one held the ambition of a high king and the means to kill for it. Monasteries, contrary to legend, were not peaceful sanctuaries. They were dynastic power centers, rich, fortified, and entangled in political alliances. At Clontarf, monks hired mercenaries. At Armagh, abbots rivaled kings. And at Bangor, chronicles speak of raids, not from across the sea, but from rival clans. This was a land already burning beneath its surface, where loyalty shifted with the wind and no fortress stood untouched by greed. But none of these rivalries prepared them for what was coming, because far beyond the horizon, a different kind of hunger had begun to stir. Before the northern tide came crashing down, Ireland lived in a delicate, almost deceptive balance, not united, but not broken. This was a land of many kings, over 100, some ruling a valley, others commanding coastlines. Their battles were frequent but familiar. Their world bounded by custom, kin, and the word of saints. In the spaces between wars, something remarkable had taken root. Centers of learning, scripture, and sanctuary. Monasteries like Duro, Talat, and Innis had become fonts of knowledge unseen anywhere else in Western Europe. Their wealth was not only spiritual. Gold from kings, relics from Rome, and gifts from pilgrims filled their treasuries. Power flowed through ink and altar just as surely as it did through sword and bloodline. Ireland's edge was wild but undisturbed. No fleets had ever come for it. No foreign kings had ever planted their banners here. Its troubles were local, its faith unchallenged. And yet, the island lay open, not by weakness, but by design. There were no walls, no standing armies, only tradition, the kind that works until it doesn't. In 795 AD, the people of Ireland woke to the same horizon they'd known for generations, wide, unbroken, and undisturbed. But on the northern edge of the world, something ancient and restless was stirring, a force that had no place in Ireland's peace. Ireland's monasteries, the very heart of its culture and power, had become rich beyond measure. But with wealth came vulnerability, and the sacred islands of Recru, now known Gaelic Michael, were not isolated enough to remain untouched. For centuries, pilgrims had arrived, bringing riches from across Europe, treasures, gifts, and foreign relics. But the time of peaceful exchange was drawing to a close, and for those who sought such treasures, the road ahead led south. In 795, they arrived, first not in their vast warlike fleets, but in shadowed boats, swift and silent. The first to be raided were the monasteries of Recru, those peaceful islands off the coast. And in those hours, the monks learned a bitter truth about their way of life. The Ez was not a sanctuary, but a target. The records from that day speak not only of destruction, but of terror, of silent, brutal invaders who seemed to appear out of nowhere. Yet they left behind more than just ruin. They left questions. Who were these invaders, truly? Was this an isolated raid, or the beginning of something far more sinister? The Vikings, it turns out, were not here just for gold. They came for something deeper, for land, for revenge, and perhaps for a new world altogether. And what they would leave behind would change Ireland forever. But the question remained, why Ireland? What had drawn them so far south? In the late 8th century, Ireland's spiritual heartbeats were not only heard in its monasteries, but also in its distant coastal winds. Peace had reigned on the island for centuries, but it was a fragile peace. To the Irish, the monasteries represented the pinnacle of their civilization, places where the sacred and the scholarly converged. They were untouchable, or so it seemed. The monasteries were rich in more than gold. They were centers of knowledge, the keepers of Irish lore and wisdom, a tradition passed down from the earliest saints. These holy grounds housed more than relics. They held the power to shape Ireland's future. But in 795 AD, something changed. A new force arrived from the north, not driven solely by desire for wealth, but by something far more systematic. The Viking raids were not random. They were the beginning of a far-reaching strategy, a calculated move to disrupt the monastic power that lay at the very core of Irish society. Monasteries were vulnerable in ways the Irish had not yet realized, not just because of their wealth, but because they represented the ideological heart of the island. To attack them was not just to pillage, it was to strike at the very foundation of Irish power and influence. And these raids, brutal and swift, were designed to destabilize not just the ecclesiastical order, but the fabric of Irish society itself. The Irish response was fragmented. While local kings had their warriors, none could unite against a force as elusive and mobile as the Vikings. Ireland's vast coastal expanse was an open door, one the Vikings would continue to knock on over and over again. For the Irish, the message was clear. Their way of life was under attack, but the true scale of the Viking threat remained unseen. For now. The first raids had come, but what would the Vikings do next? And what would Ireland do in response? The year is 795 AD. The first Viking raid on Ireland has just struck, but this is not the beginning of a random storm of violence. No, this is the first calculated strike in a series of encounters that would define centuries of history. What led these seafaring warriors to cross the North Sea, leaving behind their crumbling lands and brutal winters? For centuries, the Vikings had lived in the shadow of the unforgiving northern winters. But it wasn't just the cold that forced their hand. It was a collapsing social order, political fragmentation, power struggles among chieftains, and a deteriorating environment all set the stage for their fateful journey. "We are not just warriors," he mutters. "We are survivors. And survival takes more than courage. It takes opportunity." Ireland, rich in resources and divided by internal struggles, seemed like an opportunity not just for plunder, but for a new beginning. But the Vikings weren't prepared for the fierce resistance awaiting them. The first raid would spark the flames of conflict. But what the Vikings didn't expect was that their raids would evolve into a deep and lasting struggle. They had underestimated the resilience of the land they sought to conquer. Before the Vikings ever set foot on the shores of Ireland, something else was brewing, a force far more powerful than any sword, a change in the earth itself that would shape the very course of history. The winds were not the only things blowing across the Nordic lands, so were the seeds of desperation. What made these fierce warriors, known for their raids, abandon everything they knew? Why did they sail so far from home into the unknown towards riches and unknown horrors? As early as 794 AD, the climate in Scandinavia began to change. A devastating drought struck with such force that the very land itself seemed to refuse the hand of its people. Through dendrochronology, tree ring dating, scientists have uncovered the profound truth. Years of severe drought devastated the region. Crops failed. The earth cracked. Resources grew scarce. It wasn't just the weather. This was a place where a man's life was bound to the land, where everything he owned depended on the harvest. Without the crops, without the land, a once prosperous people began to feel the weight of starvation. For the Vikings, a culture that celebrated war, this was no ordinary hardship. It was the very foundation of their survival that had cracked. The land does not speak to us as it once did. It does not give, it takes. But the land wasn't the only thing closing in. The Viking world itself was confined by rigid social hierarchies. Every man, woman, and child was placed into one of the few slots available in a highly structured society. Chieftains ruled, warriors fought, and farmers scraped by. For the majority, the idea of moving up the ladder was nothing more than a dream. There was little room to rise. A son inherited his father's status, and a daughter's fate was tied to the will of men. It was a world where ambition had no escape, unless, of course, you dared to break free. Your name will carry weight only if you make it yourself. But that won't happen here. You must go where the land does not tie your feet. For some, the only escape from this rigid system was across the sea toward distant shores. But where could they go? What could they do? The answer lay beyond the horizon, in a place where wealth and power could be seized or lost in an instant. The seafaring prowess of the Vikings was unparalleled. In these boats, they saw more than just a tool of war. They saw their future. A ship could carry them across the seas to places of unimaginable wealth, places where status could be bought with gold, where power could be seized with iron. We do not wait for fortune, we take it. We have nothing left here to lose, but everything to gain out there. The gods will be with us. We do this not just for wealth. We do this for survival. It was not just greed that drove the Vikings westward. It was desperation, a need to survive and claim a future. But little did they know, the land they sought would not easily yield. Ireland, a land of monasteries, wealth, and political fragmentation, lay just beyond the waves. Ireland had no idea what was coming. The storm of steel, fire, and blood was about to shatter their peace. But why would these barbarians choose a land filled with God's peace? What was their true aim? What drove them to these shores? Was it the promise of riches? Or was it something deeper, something far darker than we ever imagined? In the land of ice and snow, where the harsh winds howl across the fjords and the trees groan under the weight of the cold, the Vikings were born. They were not simply warriors, they were survivors, innovators, and above all, masters of the sea. But how did these people, with nothing but wood, rope, and iron, create a fleet that would span the continents? It began with one simple thing: an understanding of the sea that was unparalleled. The Vikings lived in a world where resources were limited and survival uncertain, but that their greatest asset was not gold or land, it was the sea. To them, the coastline was not a boundary, but a gateway. Here, in the isolated coastal towns of Scandinavia, they developed a ship that would change history. A longship was more than just a boat. It was a symbol of power, of innovation. A longship could cut through stormy seas or sneak into river mouths undetected. This was no accident. These ships were designed for one thing: mobility. They could go anywhere, across rivers, up coasts, even across the wide ocean. For the Vikings, the sea was not simply a means of travel. It was a tool of conquest. Unlike the empires of the Mediterranean, which relied on traditional roads and armies, the Vikings were agile. Their ships allowed them to strike suddenly and retreat before any retaliation could form. The raids began not with wanton destruction, but with purpose. Strategic targets, wealthy monasteries, isolated villages, undefended coasts. The longship was not just a vessel of war, it was a tool of terror. It struck fear into the hearts of those it reached, not because of its violence, but because of its unpredictability. But these raids were not just born out of greed. The Vikings were not simply after wealth, they were driven by desperation. Climate change had gripped their homelands. A devastating drought in 794 AD had drained their crops, and harsh winters followed. The earth could no longer feed them. For many, the decision to set sail wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. The Vikings were trapped, bound by rigid social hierarchies that offered few opportunities to rise. To survive, they had to break free. And so, with their ships, the Vikings set out for lands unknown, not as invaders at first, but as desperate men seeking a way to survive. But what they would find would change not just their world, but the very course of history. In the next chapter, we will follow these warriors as they land on Ireland's shores, where not only their fate, but the fate of an entire civilization would be decided. What would the Irish make of these seafaring strangers? And could they ever truly conquer the wild heart of this island? In the year 841, an island that had known peace for centuries would find itself swept up in a storm that changed its history forever. But this storm wasn't simply a force of nature, it was a force of men, driven not by blind greed, but by survival. When the first Viking ships touched the shores of Ireland, they came not with the sole purpose of destruction, but to establish something far more enduring. At first, it seemed like another raid, a typical Viking attack on a vulnerable monastery. But this time, something shifted. By 841 AD, the Vikings weren't just raiders. They were beginning to plant the seeds of something bigger. A settlement, a stronghold, a city that would rise on the bones of centuries-old Irish traditions. But to understand how Dublin was born, we need to understand why it was necessary. Ireland in the 9th century was a land divided, ruled by a patchwork of powerful kings and thriving monastic centres. The Irish had long considered their monasteries sacred, untouchable places of refuge. But what they didn't realize was that they had something the Vikings coveted: wealth, power, and strategic land. While the Irish lived in peace, their world was about to change. The Vikings saw the potential for something more than plunder. They sought not just wealth, but a foothold on this land, a position from which they could control the very sea that brought them here. The raids were not random, they were calculated. The Vikings were master sailors, and they knew the power of the sea better than anyone. What the Irish didn't understand was that the Vikings weren't just here to take, they were here to build. They saw Ireland as a fertile ground for expansion, a place where they could establish not only a trading base, but a strategic military outpost for future conquests. The Vikings chose Dublin's location carefully, right at the mouth of the River Liffey, a crucial point where trade and military expansion could be facilitated. But would this settlement thrive? Or would the Irish kings force them back into the sea? The Viking settlement on the River Liffey didn't go unnoticed. The Irish kings, already divided among themselves, realized that this new threat could not be ignored. Ireland's rich soil and its monks' treasures were now in danger. But what the Irish didn't know was that the Vikings had no intention of leaving. The battle for Dublin was not just a fight for land, it was a battle for survival. The Vikings were here to stay, and they would not be easily pushed out. The Irish kings faced a new kind of enemy, one that combined ferocity with cunning. In the midst of warfare, Dublin began to take shape, not just as a city, but as the epicenter of Viking influence in Ireland. It was here, at the convergence of trade, sea, and power, that the Viking Age in Ireland would be written. And despite the constant clashes, Dublin would become the beating heart of a Viking empire that would last for centuries. From the ashes of violence and ambition, a city was born. A city that would not only shape Ireland's future, but also become a beacon of Viking dominance in the West. But the story of Dublin is far from over. The real battle for control, power, and survival was just beginning. In the next episode, we explore the deepening political intrigue in Dublin. Would the Vikings ever truly conquer Ireland, or would the Irish kings rise to drive them out? Stay with us to find out. The Slave Empire, human cargo and brutal commerce. In the cold darkness of the northern seas, longships broke through the fog, fleets of warriors with axes sharp and bloodlust running deep. Their purpose was not merely to conquer, it was far more insidious. For some, it was the power to rule. For others, it was the need to survive. And for those who dared to resist, it would mean a fate darker than death itself. Before the Viking raiders arrived, Ireland was a place of peace, a tapestry of rich cultures and kingdoms, each a world of its own. At the heart of the island stood monasteries, untouched sanctuaries of knowledge, wealth, and devotion. But Ireland, like most of Europe, was unprepared for the storm on its horizon. What the Irish didn't know was that across the seas, a darker force was rising. In Scandinavia, under extreme social pressures, the Vikings were preparing not just to raid, but to reshape the future of the island. But their raids in the beginning were not just driven by greed. There was something far more compelling: desperation. The Vikings had no choice. The land they left behind was barren, their resources dwindling. A climate catastrophe, recorded in the rings of ancient trees, had begun around 794 AD, leading to the collapse of crops. But it wasn't just the weather. The rigid social hierarchies of Viking society left little room for upward mobility. Those who could not fight or conquer would fade into the shadows, and so they turned to the sea. Not just for riches, but for survival. For the first time in history, a new kind of trade began. One not driven by goods, but by human lives. In 795 AD, the first wave of Viking raids struck Ireland's shores. They targeted the monasteries, rich with silver, gold, and treasures. But the true cost was far greater. They took not just wealth, but people, priests, nuns, laborers, anyone they could find. The monasteries had always been seen as untouchable, the spiritual heart of the island. But the Vikings knew better. They didn't just raid for treasure, they sought human cargo. As the raids intensified, Dublin was transformed. What was once a small Viking settlement would soon become a thriving market for human beings. Not just a city of warriors, but one built on the backs of those they enslaved. The Vikings didn't just enslave for labor. They enslaved to fuel their empire. Slaves were not just farmhands. Some were forced into battle, others into the darkest corners of Viking life. Dublin was but one hub in a vast network. The Viking slave trade extended beyond the shores of Ireland, reaching as far as Byzantium and the Islamic caliphates. Traders exchanged slaves for riches, goods, and weapons. This was the true wealth of the Vikings. Not gold, not silver, but people. Through their longships, the Vikings connected two worlds, one of desperate raiders and the other of prosperous civilizations, all connected by the currency of human lives. The Vikings may have integrated into Irish society over time, their culture intermingling with the Irish, but the dark legacy of their slave empire did not fade. The bones of the enslaved still rest in the earth, hidden beneath Dublin's streets. Ireland may have been reshaped by the Vikings, but the human toll, the lives broken, the families destroyed, cannot be erased from history. The Vikings' rise to power was built not on gold, but on human suffering. And that story, though hidden in the shadows of history, still echoes through the ages. But who were these people? The enslaved? What stories did they carry, and what secrets were buried along with them? In our next episode, we'll delve into the lives of the captives, their strength, their survival, and the untold stories of those who dared to fight back against the empire of human commerce. In the cold northern seas, a king was born not through birthright, but through vengeance. Ivar the Boneless, son of the legendary Ragnar Lodbrok, would prove that even a crippled body can hold the heart of a conqueror. But what makes a king? What is the true measure of power? Ivar was born with a twisted leg, mocked for his apparent weakness, but his mind, sharp, calculating, was the weapon he would use to rise above his brothers and become one of the most feared rulers of the Viking world. Ragnar Lodbrok was a king who changed the Viking world forever. His conquest spread terror across Europe. His sons, each a legacy in their own right, would rise from the ashes of his betrayal. But for Ivar, it was not simply vengeance that called him to power. It was the need to forge his own destiny, to prove he was more than his father's son. Ragnar's death would ignite the spark in Ivar, a rage that could not be extinguished. But what kind of man was Ivar? What lay beneath the vengeance-fueled rage? While his brothers wielded swords and axes, Ivar wielded strategy. His greatest weapon was not his strength. It was his ability to manipulate those around him, to turn enemies into allies and fear into obedience. The great heathen army was not merely a group of raiders, it was a force of psychological warfare. He would not conquer through sheer force alone. Ivar understood that the key to ruling was not just about taking land, it was about shaping minds, controlling hearts. His strategic genius would lead him to the throne of Northumbria, but at what cost? By 865 AD, Ivar led the great heathen army, a force not only of Vikings but of vengeance and conquest. His army was swift, brutal, and unstoppable. Northumbria would fall, but the real question was, could Ivar's thirst for blood ever be satisfied? The people of England knew that this was no ordinary Viking raid. This was a reckoning, one that would echo throughout history. But for Ivar, it wasn't about the loot. It was about revenge against Aella and the claiming of his father's throne. Ivar did not just conquer lands. He created an empire of fear. His reign was one of psychological manipulation, where even his closest allies feared him. His use of terror was unparalleled, but his true brilliance lay in his ability to rule from the shadows. But fear has a price. With each conquest, Ivar's empire grew, yet With his power came the human cost, slavery, oppression, and unrelenting brutality. He had turned his kingdom into a slave empire where men, women, and children were mere commodities. Under Ivar's rule, Northumbria would become a key node in the Viking slave trade, with Dublin emerging as a crucial centre. Thousands of slaves would be taken from Ireland and beyond, brought to serve Ivar's dark empire. Ivar understood the value of people as much as land or gold. His empire was built on human suffering, and it would take generations to unravel the horrors of what he created. But no empire built on fear can last. As the 870s wore on, Ivar's health began to deteriorate. His twisted leg, which had once been a symbol of his strength, now crippled him physically. And with his death, the empire he had forged would begin to unravel. Ivar the Boneless, the King of Shadows, would die not in battle, but in anguish. And yet, his legacy, the empire he built through manipulation, terror, and cunning, would haunt Ireland and England for centuries. The end of Ivar's reign would signal a new chapter in Viking history. His death may have marked the fall of one empire, but his methods, the power of the shadow, would continue to shape the Viking world for years to come. Join us next time as we explore the lasting impact of Ivar's legacy on Ireland and the Viking world. They ruled, married, built, but they never surrendered completely. Not their gods, not their blood, and certainly not their pride. But what happens when your children no longer understand the language of your gods? By 1000 AD, most Norse Gaelic children in Dublin no longer spoke Old Norse. A woman caught between worlds used fusion as a weapon, not peace. 1,000 years later, Viking blood still runs in Ireland. But the gods, the sagas, the language, they're buried beneath cathedrals, city walls, and DNA. On the morning of April the 23rd, 1014, Good Friday, Ireland's High King knelt before a wooden crucifix, unaware that he was already a dead man. Outside, on the blood-soaked plain of Clontarf, armies stirred. Not just for God, not just if Brian Boru was not born to rule. He carved his throne from a land of shattered loyalties, where kings were kings of fields, not peoples, and swords settled more than laws ever did. He was Ard Rí, High King, but only in name. His authority dangled by threads of forced alliances. The northern Uí Néill scorned him. Leinster simmered with rebellion, and Dublin watched, waited, plotted. In that city, a queen once cast aside would fan a war that swallowed her past, or gold, but for a vision of Ireland that would never come again. Few names in Irish history burn like Gormflaith, Queen of Dublin, Queen of Tara, wife to kings, mother to another. She'd once married Brian Boru. Now she would undo him. Through her son, Sigtryg Silkbeard, Norse King of Dublin, she sent messengers north to the Orkneys, west to the Isle of Man, to Jarl Sigurd and Viking warlords. Her offer was simple: land, silver, vengeance. The Norse came, not for Dublin, but for destiny. 7,000 stood behind Brian Boru, an army forged from southern kingdoms and old grudges. Opposite them, 6,000 warriors, Norse, Manx, Irish rebels. Among them, Jarl Sigurd, warrior prince of the Isles, Brodir of Man, rumoured sorcerer and berserker. Their banners flew under one name: Dublin. The tide turned, literally. As Norse reinforcements crossed the Tolka estuary, the waters surged. Dozens drowned in their armour. The gods had chosen. But fate wasn't finished. While his army crushed the last Norse lines, Brian Boru, nearly 80, remained in his tent, deep in prayer. As dusk fell, 2 Norsemen, fleeing the carnage, discovered the tent. What followed was not a duel, but a murder. The High King of Ireland, swordless, was hacked to death with an axe, and with him the dream of a unified Ireland died too. Clontarf was not the end of the Vikings. Dublin would remain Norse Gaelic for another 150 years, but it was the end of an era of Norse expansion, of foreign dominance. So after Clontarf, Viking power fractured. The sea kings of the north lost their taste for Irish conquest. Brian's death became legend, but his victory was more complex. Ireland was not free, but it had drawn blood enough to be feared. In the mud at Clontarf, Ireland did not find peace, but it found something older, deeper, a memory of who it was and who it refused to become. By the turn of the 12th century, something extraordinary had happened in Ireland, but no one recorded it. The invaders were gone, their longships vanished, their gods silent, but their cities remained. There was no grand retreat, no Viking last stand. The sagas fall silent. And yet, in the heart of Dublin, Norse brooches are found beside Irish crucifixes, Norse swords buried next to Gaelic saints. They were called the Osman, the men from the east. After Clontarf, Norse settlers weren't expelled. They were renamed. Medieval Irish law codified them as a special class, neither foreign nor native, exempt from some taxes, allowed to trade, allowed to stay. It was bureaucracy, not warfare, that swallowed the Vikings whole. Modern genetic studies confirm what the monks did not. Viking ancestry survives in Ireland. Roughly 10% of men in coastal cities carry Y-DNA markers linked to Scandinavian founders, especially near Waterford, Cork, and Dublin, the Viking triangle. The ships left, but their legacy stayed in blood. Why then did history forget them? Because the winners, Brian Boru's heirs, the Gaelic clergy, had no reason to remember. What was once horror became trade. What was once terror became taxation. The Vikings didn't disappear. They were redacted. Look closely and you'll see them. In surnames, in trade routes, in the bones beneath your feet. If the Vikings never left, why did we stop saying their names? History books say the Viking Age ended in 1066, but in Ireland their cities grew stronger after their so-called fall. From Dublin to Waterford, the Norse, known as Ostmen, were trading, marrying, burying their dead on Irish soil until the 1170s. That's nearly 400 years of Norse-Irish life. So if they lived, worked, built ports, paid taxes, when did we begin pretending they were gone? When the Normans invaded in 1169, chroniclers sought a clean narrative, Gael versus Norman. The Ostmen didn't fit. Some Irish texts labelled them as traitors, others ignored them entirely. And so, like dust beneath a rising flood, they dissolved into silence. But names don't lie. Doyle, MacLaughlin, MacLean. These are not just Irish, they're Viking echoes. Modern genetics tells a quiet truth. In parts of Ireland, up to 20% of Y-DNA lineages show Scandinavian ancestry. And not just in the east. Limerick, Cork, even Sligo, where no Viking armies ever camped, carry the genetic whisper of Norse blood. This wasn't conquest, it was absorption. Somewhere under Dublin, beneath concrete and tram lines, lies a carved bone comb, dropped by a Norse woman around 950 AD. She wasn't a raider, she was a mother, a wife, a trader. Her story was never written, but she was real. History remembers kings and wars, but cities remember the people. Ireland owes its ports to Viking engineering. its surnames to Norse fathers, its blood to both. To forget them is not to preserve identity, it is to amputate it. The Vikings didn't vanish. We buried them beneath a story we wanted more, but they're still here, if you're willing to dig. What if the Viking in your family tree never left? Would you call yourself Irish still? Or something more? If this history moved you, don't let it vanish to the shadows. Like, share, and subscribe. There are more forgotten stories waiting to be unearthed.